55 miles south of the demilitarized zone, in the early spring of 1972, North Vietnam was preparing to launch the largest military offensive since the Tet attacks of 1968. On March 30th, Easter weekend, 14 North Vietnamese Army divisions crossed the DMZ in a conventional assault that would shock American military planners and test the limits of Vietnamization. This was no longer guerrilla warfare. This was tanks, artillery, and massive infantry formations supported by the most sophisticated air defense network the North Vietnamese had ever deployed. The Easter offensive had begun, and it would create the circumstances for one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in American military history. Make sure you subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories from history. Just 3 days into this massive invasion, on April 2, 1972, an Air Force EB-66C electronic warfare aircraft designated BAT-21 was flying a Pathfinder mission for a cell of 3 B-52 bombers. The aircraft's job was critical: identify enemy surface-to-air missile sites, jam their radars, and protect the heavy bombers as they struck targets along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. In the navigator's seat sat 53-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Gene Hambleton, a man who should never have been on that mission. As the unit scheduler, Hambleton normally coordinated crew assignments from the safety of his desk. But they were short-staffed that day, and Hambleton made a fateful decision to fill in himself. It was the worst possible choice. Hambleton wasn't just any navigator. He was one of the most knowledgeable electronic warfare and missile countermeasures experts in the entire United States Air Force. He had spent over 20 years in military service, flying 43 combat missions in a B-29 during the Korean War, and then working on some of America's most sensitive strategic missile programs, including the Jupiter, Titan Y, and Titan II intercontinental ballistic missiles. Before Vietnam, he had been the Deputy Chief of Operations for Strategic Air Command's 390th Strategic Missile Wing. The man knew the vulnerabilities of every B-52 in the Air Force inventory. He understood SAC targeting procedures. He possessed top-secret clearance to some of America's most sensitive military operations. If he were captured and interrogated by Soviet intelligence officers, the damage to American national security would be catastrophic. At approximately 29,000 feet, cruising through clear skies over Quang Tri Province just south of the DMZ, BAT-21 was suddenly illuminated by enemy radar. A Soviet-built SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile, a weapon the size of a telephone pole with a proximity-fused warhead lethal within 150 feet, came streaking up from the ground. The crew had successfully evaded SAM launches more than 100 times before. Their standard procedure was a sharp brake maneuver that subjected the aircraft to 5 Gs of force, more than enough to defeat the missile's guidance systems, which failed at about 2 Gs. But something was different this time. Perhaps the missile site was closer than anticipated. Perhaps the crew's reaction time was a fraction of a second too slow. Whatever the reason, the SA-2 found its mark. The warhead detonated near BAT-21 with a blast that tore the aircraft apart. Metal twisted, fuel ignited, and the EB-66 began breaking up in mid-air. Of the 6 crew members aboard, only Hambleton managed to eject. He pulled his ejection handle and felt the violent kick of the rocket motor propelling him clear of the dying aircraft. His parachute deployed automatically, and suddenly the chaos of the explosion gave way to an eerie silence as he floated down through a fog bank. He had 20 minutes during that descent to contemplate what was about to happen. Just 9 months from retirement, Hambleton had no intention of dying in a rice paddy in Vietnam. He was determined to survive, confident that his fellow Americans would come for him. What he didn't know was that he had just parachuted directly into the path of 30,000 North Vietnamese troops. Hambleton landed hard in a rice paddy, approximately 1 mile east of Cam Lo Village and the crucial Cam Lo Bridge. The bridge was a key objective in the North Vietnamese offensive, and the area was swarming with NVA soldiers, artillery positions, and anti-aircraft batteries. He gathered his parachute, took stock of his survival equipment, and made his way to a wooded area as darkness fell. Within hours, he had established radio contact with a forward air controller, an O-2 FAC pilot, who would become his lifeline to the outside world. The Air Force immediately launched what would become the largest, longest, and most complex search and rescue operation in the history of the Vietnam War. The first rescue attempt came within minutes of Hambleton hitting the ground. An Army UH-1H helicopter, designated Blue Ghost 39, flew directly toward his position, not knowing that the landing zone was completely controlled by enemy forces. The NVA gunners held their fire until the helicopter was committed to its approach, then opened up with everything they had. Heavy machine guns, small arms, and possibly even anti-aircraft artillery tore into the Huey. The helicopter crashed, and all 4 crew members were either killed on impact or captured. It was a disaster, but it was only the beginning. On April 3rd, the Air Force sent in an OV-10 Bronco forward air control aircraft to assist with the rescue. The pilot was Captain William Henderson, with First Lieutenant Mark Clark as his observer. As they circled over Hambleton's position, directing airstrikes against enemy forces, they too were hit by ground fire. Both men ejected from their doomed aircraft, parachuting down near the Muo Jiang River. Henderson was captured almost immediately by NVA troops. He would spend the next 369 days as a prisoner of war, enduring interrogation and captivity in North Vietnamese camps. Clark managed to evade capture, hiding along the south bank of the river, but now there were 2 Americans trapped behind enemy lines instead of 1. The Air Force continued throwing resources at the problem. On April 4th, 8 fighter aircraft sustained battle damage during support missions, and 1 was destroyed. 2 days later, on April 6th, 52 sorties of fighters and 4 B-52 bombers pounded the area around Hambleton's position in preparation for another rescue attempt. A helicopter flew in through the maelstrom of fire, but enemy guns found it. The aircraft was hit and went down hard. All 6 crew members aboard were killed. Another OV-10 was shot down on April 7th, with both airmen lost. The casualty count was becoming horrific, and Hambleton was still on the ground. By April 9th, the situation had become a crisis at the highest levels of American military command. 11 men were dead, 2 Americans were captured, 3 more pilots, including Hambleton, Clark, and Lieutenant Bruce Walker, were trapped behind enemy lines. 5 aircraft had been destroyed, and 19 others had been damaged. To protect Hambleton and support the rescue efforts, a standard no-fire zone with a radius of 17 miles had been established around his position. This meant that American artillery, naval gunfire, and aircraft could not engage targets within that zone without special approval. The problem was that this no-fire zone encompassed nearly the entire combat zone of the South Vietnamese 3rd Division, including the critical Cam Lo Bridge that the North Vietnamese were using to funnel troops and supplies into the battle. The cost of the Bat-21 rescue was creating serious operational problems. As many as 90 air sorties per day were being diverted to support the rescue effort. Sorties that should have been attacking North Vietnamese forces or supporting South Vietnamese troops fighting for their lives. The debate at higher headquarters was intense and increasingly bitter. Some argued that the resources being expended to save one man, however valuable his knowledge, were enabling the North Vietnamese to achieve tactical victories that were costing many more American and South Vietnamese lives. Others countered that abandoning an American serviceman, especially one with Hambleton's sensitive knowledge, was unthinkable. General Creighton Abrams, the overall commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, made the decision: no more airborne rescue attempts. They were simply too costly. If Hambleton, Clark, and Walker were to be saved, it would have to be done on the ground. Thomas Roland Norris was not the kind of man who looked like Hollywood's version of an elite warrior. Born on January 14, 1944, in Jacksonville, Florida, he had grown up in a Navy family that moved frequently, living in Michigan, Wisconsin, and eventually settling in the Washington, D.C. area, where he graduated from Montgomery Blair High School in Silver Spring, Maryland. As a youth, he had achieved the rank of Eagle Scout, run track, and become an accomplished wrestler. At the University of Maryland, he won the Atlantic Coast Conference Wrestling Championship in both 1965 and 1966. He graduated with a degree in sociology, planning to pursue his dream of becoming an FBI agent specializing in criminology. But the draft was calling, and when his student deferment wasn't extended, Norris made the decision to enlist in the Navy rather than be drafted into the Army. He initially hoped to become a naval aviator, but problems with his depth perception disqualified him from flight training. It seemed like a setback at the time, but it led Norris to transfer to Naval Special Warfare. He volunteered for the SEALs, joining what was arguably the most demanding training program in the American military. The instructors at BUD-S, Basic Underwater Demolition Yard SEAL Training, had serious doubts about Norris. He was slight of build, didn't fit the physical profile of the typical SEAL candidate, and struggled during some of the more demanding evolutions. The instructors considered removing him from the course, but there was something about Norris that made them reconsider. He had an inner toughness that went beyond physical strength, a quiet determination that refused to accept failure. When the surf was pounding, when hypothermia was setting in, when his body was screaming for rest, Norris kept going. The instructors decided to give him a chance to finish the training, and Norris graduated from BUD-S Class 45. He had become a Navy SEAL, joining one of the most elite combat units in the world. His first tour in Vietnam with SEAL Team 2 earned him a Bronze Star with Combat Vi device for his actions under fire. He returned to the United States, but in March 1971, he volunteered for a second tour. By April 1972, Lieutenant Thomas Norris was one of the few remaining SEALs in Vietnam, serving as an advisor with MXV-SOG's Da Nang Naval Advisory Detachment. When the call came on April 9th to mount a ground rescue operation for the downed pilots, Norris was the logical choice. He had experience working with South Vietnamese Special Forces units, particularly the LDNN, Lien Doc Nguyen Nhia, which translated roughly to soldiers who fight under the sea, the Vietnamese equivalent of Navy SEALs. He was comfortable operating in the kind of denied territory where the pilots were trapped, and perhaps most importantly, he was willing to accept a mission that everyone understood was likely to end in death. Norris was briefed on the situation. 3 American pilots trapped behind enemy lines, surrounded by 30,000 North Vietnamese troops, in an area so dangerous that 11 rescue attempts had already ended in disaster. The mission was to somehow infiltrate enemy territory, locate the pilots, and bring them out alive. The odds of success were minimal. Norris understood what he was being asked to do. This wasn't a quick in-and-out helicopter extraction. This was going to require moving on foot or by small boat through multiple miles of enemy-controlled terrain, evading detection by vastly superior forces, locating men who might be injured or disoriented, and then making it back through those same enemy positions with non-combatants in tow. If they were detected, there would be no backup, no quick reaction force, no cavalry riding to the rescue. They would be on their own in the middle of the largest enemy offensive of the war. When Norris was asked if he would accept the mission, his response was immediate and unequivocal. An American was down in enemy territory. Of course, he would do it. Norris began assembling his team. He handpicked 5 members of the South Vietnamese Sea Commandos, LDNN operators who had trained alongside American SEALs and who understood the demands of special operations. These were not regular Vietnamese troops. They were elite fighters who had volunteered for some of the most dangerous missions of the war. Norris knew he could count on their skills, their courage, and their knowledge of local terrain and tactics. Together, they began planning the operation. The forward operating base would be an undermanned and exposed bunker on a hill overlooking the Cam Lo River. It was far from ideal, constantly under threat of enemy attack, but it was the closest position to where the pilots were believed to be hiding. The plan for rescuing Mark Clark, who was hiding along the river south of Hambleton's position, called for the team to move upriver at night, using the darkness to conceal their movement from enemy patrols. Clark would be told via radio to get into the river and float downstream to a predetermined interception point. The team would wait in position, extract him from the water, and move back to the forward operating base before daylight exposed them. It was a simple plan, which was good, because simple plans had the best chance of working under extreme pressure. Norris briefed his team, checked their equipment, and waited for nightfall on April 10th. As darkness fell, Norris and his 5 Vietnamese teammates moved out from the forward operating base. They carried minimal equipment, weapons, ammunition, radios, and survival gear. The night was dark, which helped conceal their movement, but also made navigation more difficult. They moved silently through enemy territory, using every bit of cover and concealment they could find. At one point, they came within meters of an enemy patrol but managed to remain undetected. The Vietnamese commandos proved their worth, moving with the practiced stealth of men who had done this kind of work many times before. They reached the river and took up positions along the bank, waiting for Mark Clark to arrive. The original plan had called for the team to swim upriver to reach the interception point, but Norris quickly realized the current was too strong. They would exhaust themselves fighting the flow and make too much noise in the process. Instead, he radioed to Clark that he should enter the water and let the current carry him downstream. Clark, who had been hiding along the riverbank for days with minimal food and water, weak from stress and exhaustion, acknowledged the instructions and prepared to move. Around 2 a.m., Norris heard heavy breathing coming from the river. He spotted Clark in the water, but at exactly the same moment, an NVA patrol arrived at the team's position. Norris faced an agonizing decision. If he signaled to Clark or tried to extract him while the enemy patrol was present, the entire operation would be compromised. If he let Clark float past, they might not be able to find him again, and Clark might drown or be spotted by enemy forces further downstream. Norris made the only choice he could. He remained frozen in place, praying that the NVA patrol wouldn't hear Clark's labored breathing or see his form moving through the dark water. The Vietnamese commandos held their positions with perfect discipline, not moving, not making a sound, barely breathing. The NVA patrol passed by without detecting either the rescue team or the floating American pilot. As soon as the enemy soldiers were out of sight, Norris and one of his commandos slipped silently into the river. They swam downstream, fighting the current, until Norris spotted Clark clinging to the riverbank. Clark was in rough shape, dehydrated, exhausted, and barely coherent. But he was alive. Norris helped him into a position where he could be towed, and the team began making their way back to the forward operating base. They moved through enemy territory as the first light of dawn began to illuminate the eastern sky, using every depression, every bit of vegetation, every shadow to conceal their movement. Several times they spotted enemy patrols and had to freeze in place or detour around them. It took hours to cover the distance back to the FOB, but finally, as full daylight arrived, they made it. Mark Clark was extracted to the medical aid station for treatment. One pilot was safe, but the most difficult rescue was still ahead. The forward operating base where Norris and his team had brought Mark Clark was not a safe place. It was a small bunker complex on an exposed hilltop, garrisoned by a handful of Americans and South Vietnamese troops, within range of enemy artillery and mortars. The North Vietnamese knew it was there, and they subjected it to regular attacks. On the afternoon of April 10th, just hours after Norris had successfully rescued Clark, the FOB came under one of the most intense bombardments it had yet experienced. Enemy rockets and mortars rained down on the position with devastating accuracy. The attack was brutal and deadly. Explosions walked across the compound, destroying equipment, collapsing bunkers, and killing defenders who couldn't reach cover in time. 2 of the Vietnamese commandos who had been part of Norris's rescue team were killed in the barrage. Several more men were wounded, including some seriously enough that they needed immediate evacuation. The medical aid station was overwhelmed with casualties. Norris found himself not just planning the next rescue operation, but fighting for the survival of the base itself. He directed counterfire from the base's limited defensive weapons, treated wounded men when the medics were overwhelmed, and helped organize the evacuation of the most seriously injured by helicopter. Clark was among those evacuated, which was fortunate because he needed medical care that the FOB couldn't provide. But the evacuation also meant that Norris had lost members of his team. Of the 5 Vietnamese commandos he had originally selected, 2 were dead and others were wounded or shaken by the intensity of the attack. Nevertheless, Norris immediately began planning the next mission, the rescue of Lieutenant Colonel Hambleton. For 5 days now, Hambleton had been on the ground, evading enemy patrols, moving from hiding place to hiding place, surviving on minimal food and water. The Air Force forward air controllers who had been in contact with him reported that Hambleton's condition was deteriorating. He was losing weight rapidly, becoming disoriented, and showing signs of giving up hope. On April 11th, the day after the devastating mortar attack, Norris led his 3 remaining Vietnamese commandos on the first attempt to reach Hambleton. They moved out from the FOB and penetrated 4 kilometers deeper into enemy territory than they had gone to rescue Clark. The area was saturated with North Vietnamese forces. Everywhere they looked, there were enemy troops, vehicles, and fighting positions. They spent hours carefully working their way through this maze of hostiles. But despite their best efforts, they couldn't locate Hambleton. The forward air controller had given them coordinates, but Hambleton, weakened and confused, had apparently moved from that position. After hours of searching with daylight approaching, Norris made the difficult decision to abort the mission and withdraw. They made it back to the FOB without being detected, but they had failed to find Hambleton. The failure weighed heavily on Norris. He knew that every day Hambleton remained on the ground, his chances of survival decreased. The man was 53 years old, far from the young pilot trained in escape and evasion. He was an electronics expert, a desk officer who had made the mistake of putting himself on a combat mission. He wasn't mentally or physically prepared for what he was enduring. Norris immediately began planning a second attempt for that night. On the evening of April 11th, he and his team moved out again, penetrating even deeper into enemy territory. They searched for hours, moving silently through areas crawling with NVA troops, but once again, they couldn't locate Hambleton. The coordinates they had been given were approximate, and in the darkness, with limited ability to communicate with Hambleton via radio without giving away their position, finding one man in that vast area was proving nearly impossible. When Norris returned to the FOB after the second failed attempt, he found that 2 of his 3 remaining Vietnamese commandos had reached their breaking point. They told him they were not willing to go out again. The mission was too dangerous, the enemy forces too numerous, the chances of success too small. They had watched 2 of their teammates die in the mortar attack. They had spent 2 nights moving through enemy territory where discovery would mean certain death. They had seen enough. Norris didn't blame them. These men had already demonstrated more courage than could be reasonably asked of any soldier. But Norris also knew that without them, the mission would be even more dangerous. He changed his approach and asked for volunteers rather than ordering anyone to accompany him. Would anyone come with him for one more attempt? One man stepped forward, Petty Officer 3rd Class. Nguyen Van Kiet, a young Vietnamese SEAL, looked at Norris and said he would go. Kiet was not a man who sought glory or recognition. He simply believed that rescuing an American serviceman was worth the risk. In that moment, a 2-man team was formed that would become the stuff of SEAL legend. Norris and Kiet would go into the heart of enemy territory, just the 2 of them, to attempt what larger and better equipped forces had failed to accomplish. On April 12th, while they prepared for their 3rd rescue attempt, a forward air controller managed to get a clear position on Hambleton and relayed the coordinates to Norris. Now they knew where to look, but getting there and getting back alive would require a miracle. The plan Norris developed was audacious to the point of insanity. Rather than trying to move on foot through enemy territory, which had proven nearly impossible, they would use a sampan, a traditional Vietnamese fishing boat. They would disguise themselves as local fishermen, dress in peasant clothing, wear conical hats, and paddle openly up the river in broad daylight or under cover of darkness. If they looked like local Vietnamese, if they moved with the confidence of men who belong there rather than the stealth of infiltrators, they might be able to blend in among the enemy forces and reach Hambleton's position. It was a desperate plan, but all the conventional approaches had failed. Sometimes the most unconventional approach was the only one that had a chance of working. On the evening of April 13th, as darkness fell over Quang Tri Province, Thomas Norris and Nguyen Van Kiet dressed themselves as Vietnamese fishermen and set out in a sampan up the Cam Lo River. They paddled slowly, trying to look like 2 local men checking fishing nets or traveling between villages. The river was the main avenue of movement in the area, and there were NVA troops everywhere along its banks. Artillery positions, supply dumps, troop concentrations, all positioned within meters of the water. As they paddled past these enemy positions, North Vietnamese soldiers looked at them, but apparently saw nothing suspicious. 2 Vietnamese men in a sampan were such a common sight that the enemy soldiers didn't give them a second glance. It was working, but Norris knew that one wrong move, one moment of suspicion, and they would be captured or killed instantly. As Norris and Kiet paddled their sampan up the Cam Lo River through the darkness of April 13th, the full insanity of what they were attempting became clear. The river was not some remote waterway flowing through empty jungle. It was the main supply route for the North Vietnamese offensive, and it was choked with enemy activity. They passed within meters of NVA troops unloading supplies from boats. They paddled past artillery positions where North Vietnamese gunners were preparing their weapons for the next barrage against South Vietnamese positions. They moved through areas where enemy soldiers were bathing in the river, washing their uniforms, filling water containers. At any moment, a sharp-eyed enemy soldier might look at them too closely, might notice something that didn't quite fit, might call out a challenge. And if that happened, there would be nowhere to run, no way to fight through the enemy forces that surrounded them on all sides. But the disguise was working better than Norris had dared hope. The conical hats, the peasant clothing, the way they moved the sampan with practiced ease, all of it contributed to an illusion of normalcy. They were just two more Vietnamese using the river, nothing worth a second glance. Norris had coordinated with the forward air controller, call sign Bilk 11, who had been working with Hambleton throughout his ordeal. They had worked out a plan for air support if Norris ran into trouble, but calling in airstrikes while in the middle of enemy forces was a last resort option. It would identify their position to every NVA unit in the area and almost certainly result in their deaths, even if it took out some of the enemy. The best outcome was to complete the mission without ever revealing who they really were. They had been paddling for hours, making their way slowly upstream, when the coordinates the forward air controller had provided brought them to a specific location along the riverbank. Hambleton was supposed to be hiding somewhere nearby. The problem was finding him without alerting the enemy forces that were literally all around them. Norris couldn't call out, couldn't use his radio at full volume, couldn't do anything that would identify them as Americans. He and Kyatt paddled slowly along the bank, searching the shadows and vegetation for any sign of the downed pilot. Hours passed, dawn was approaching, and they still hadn't found Hambleton. If daylight caught them out here, their disguise would be much less effective, and the danger would multiply. Then Norris saw something, a slight movement in the vegetation along the bank, different from the random motion of plants in the breeze. He paddled closer, moving with exaggerated casualness, and spotted Hambleton. The lieutenant colonel looked terrible. He had lost 40 pounds during his 11.5 days on the ground. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion and stress. He was barely able to move, weakened by dehydration and malnutrition. When he saw Norris and Kyatt, dressed as Vietnamese fishermen, he initially didn't understand who they were. For a terrifying moment, Hambleton may have thought he was being captured. Then Norris whispered in English, identifying himself, and Hambleton's expression changed from fear to relief, so profound it was almost painful to witness. Getting Hambleton into the sampan required care. The man was so weak he could barely stand, let alone climb into a boat without capsizing it. Norris and Kyatt helped him in as gently and quietly as possible, then immediately laid him flat in the bottom of the sampan. They covered him with bamboo leaves and vegetation, creating the appearance of a fishing boat carrying nothing more than some gathered plant material. Hambleton was hidden from view, but anyone who looked closely or who stopped the boat for inspection would immediately discover him. There was no time to worry about that now. They had to start moving back downstream before full daylight exposed them. The return journey was when things went wrong. As they paddled downstream, trying to look like fishermen heading home after a night on the river, they were spotted by an NVA patrol. Something about them must have raised suspicion, or perhaps the patrol was simply being thorough in checking everyone on the river. The enemy soldiers called out to them in Vietnamese, ordering them to bring the boat to shore. Norris and Kyatt kept paddling, pretending not to hear, or perhaps pretending to be simple fishermen who didn't understand military commands. The NVA patrol's tone became more insistent, more threatening. Norris made a split-second decision. He reached for his radio and called in the air support they had prearranged. Within minutes, Air Force fighters were screaming overhead. They dove in on the NVA patrol positions, rockets and guns blazing, creating a maelstrom of explosions and fire along the riverbank. The enemy soldiers who had been about to intercept Norris's sampan were suddenly fighting for their lives as high explosive warheads detonated around their positions. Norris and Kyatt used the chaos to increase their paddling speed, putting distance between themselves and the enemy. But the airstrikes had revealed that something important was happening on this river, and more NVA units began converging on the area. They weren't out of danger yet, not even close. As they approached the area near the forward operating base, they came under heavy machine gun fire from entrenched enemy positions. Bullets snapped through the air, impacting the water around the sampan, several rounds hitting the boat itself. Norris, grabbed his radio again and called for another airstrike, this time requesting both suppression fire and a smokescreen to conceal their final approach to the FOB. The Air Force pilots responded with precision and courage that matched Norris's own. They made attack runs directly over the enemy positions, their guns and rockets silencing the machine gun nests, while other aircraft laid down a smokescreen that obscured the sampan from enemy view. Under cover of that smoke and suppressing fire, Norris and Kayet paddled frantically for the riverbank near the FOB. They made it, against all odds, through enemy territory crawling with 30,000 North Vietnamese troops, past artillery positions and infantry concentrations, through patrol checkpoints and under enemy fire. They had made it back with Lieutenant Colonel Hambleton. As they pulled the sampan up onto the bank, friendly forces rushed down to help extract Hambleton and get him to the medical aid station. The lieutenant colonel was in serious condition, suffering from severe dehydration, malnutrition, infected wounds, and near total exhaustion. But he was alive. After 11.5 days on the ground, after the largest and most costly rescue operation in Air Force history, after 11 Americans had died trying to save him, Gene Hambleton was finally safe. In the days following Hambleton's rescue, the full scope of what the operation had cost began to emerge, and it was staggering. 11 Americans had been killed in various rescue attempts. 2 others had been captured, including Captain William Henderson, who would spend more than a year as a prisoner of war. 6 aircraft had been destroyed, and 19 others had been damaged. More than 800 air sorties had been flown in direct support of the rescue efforts, sorties that had been diverted from other critical missions during the height of the North Vietnamese offensive. The 17-mile no-fire zone around Hambleton's position had effectively halted offensive air operations in a crucial sector, allowing NVA forces to advance with less opposition than they would otherwise have faced. The strategic impact was significant and controversial. The South Vietnamese 3rd Division, which had been desperately fighting to hold back the North Vietnamese advance, had been denied critical air support because those aircraft were flying cover for Hambleton. The Cam Lo Bridge, a key piece of infrastructure that the North Vietnamese were using to funnel troops and supplies south, had remained intact longer than it should have because it fell within the no-fire zone. Some Army advisors working with ARVN units argued bitterly that the resources expended to save one man, however valuable his knowledge, had enabled enemy tactical victories that cost many more American and South Vietnamese lives. It was a valid point, and the debate would continue for years. But there was another perspective, one that ultimately prevailed in the military's institutional memory. The United States military does not abandon its people. The code is simple. You take care of your own, you bring them home, you never leave anyone behind. This principle is fundamental to military culture because it creates a bond of trust between leaders and troops. Soldiers will take extraordinary risks, will charge into the face of enemy fire, will volunteer for the most dangerous missions, because they know with absolute certainty that if they fall, their brothers will come for them. Abandoning Hambleton would have saved resources and lives in the short term, but it would have broken that bond of trust and had incalculable long-term costs to morale and cohesion. Hambleton himself was profoundly affected by what had been endured to rescue him. He knew men had died trying to save his life. He carried that weight for the rest of his days. After his rescue, he was debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted to ensure that he hadn't revealed any classified information to the enemy and who sought to learn from his experience. Hambleton was awarded the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, the Meritorious Service Medal, and a Purple Heart for his actions and his ordeal. He retired from the Air Force about a year after his rescue and settled in Arizona, where he continued to play golf, the hobby that had inadvertently helped save his life. During his time on the ground, the forward air controllers had used golf courses as a code to give him directions, telling him to walk the equivalent of specific holes on courses he had played. Hambleton's photographic memory of golf courses had allowed him to understand the coded directions without the enemy comprehending what was being communicated. For Lieutenant Mark Clark, the first pilot Norris had rescued, the experience was also transformative. He had spent days hiding along the river, knowing that multiple rescue attempts had failed and that men had died trying to reach him. When Norris and his team finally pulled him from the water, Clark was barely functional, running on nothing but survival instinct. and the will to see his family again. After his evacuation and recovery, Clark would carry his own burden of guilt about the lives lost in rescue attempts. But he also developed a profound respect for the men like Norris who risked everything to bring him home. It's worth noting that Clark was not related to the famous World War II General Mark Clark, though this misconception appeared in some early accounts. He was simply a young Air Force officer who found himself in an impossible situation and was saved by the courage of others. Lieutenant Bruce Walker, the third pilot trapped behind enemy lines during the Bat-21 rescue operation, was not as fortunate. Despite the best efforts of rescue forces, Walker was discovered and killed by North Vietnamese troops before anyone could reach him. His death was a stark reminder that not every rescue attempt succeeds, that sometimes courage and skill are not enough to overcome the odds. Walker's loss added to the heavy price paid during the Easter offensive, and his name was added to the long list of Americans who gave their lives in Vietnam. Thomas Norris had accomplished something extraordinary. He had led 4 separate missions into enemy territory during the most intense phase of the North Vietnamese offensive. He had successfully rescued 2 American pilots against overwhelming odds. He had demonstrated the kind of courage, tactical skill, and determination that defined the special operations community at its best. But when Navy investigators began looking into his actions with an eye towards recommending him for the Medal of Honor, Norris initially declined to submit the paperwork. He didn't feel he deserved the nation's highest military decoration. He had simply done his job, completed the mission he had been assigned, brought Americans home. In Norris's view, that was what you did when you wore the uniform. It didn't require special recognition. Norris did, however, strongly support the nomination of Petty Officer 3rd Class Nguyen Van Kiet for the Navy Cross, the highest award the Navy could give to a foreign national. Kiet had volunteered for the most dangerous mission when all the other Vietnamese commandos had refused to go further. He had paddled that sampan through the heart of enemy territory with the same calm professionalism as Norris. He had risked his life to save an American he had never met, motivated purely by a sense of duty and solidarity with his American allies. In 1976, Kiet was awarded the Navy Cross, becoming only the 2nd South Vietnamese to receive that decoration during the entire Vietnam War. It was a recognition richly deserved and one that highlighted the contributions of the Vietnamese special operators who fought alongside American forces. The question of Norris's Medal of Honor didn't go away just because he declined to submit paperwork. When the rescue of Clark and Hambleton was finally declassified in 1975, Navy investigators conducted a thorough review of the action. They interviewed participants, examined after-action reports, and assessed the mission against the standards for the nation's highest military decoration. Their conclusion was unequivocal. Thomas Norris's actions met every criterion for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation went forward regardless of Norris's personal feelings. And on March 6, 1976, Lieutenant Thomas Norris stood in the White House as President Gerald Ford placed the light blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor around his neck. In attendance at that ceremony was Petty Officer 2nd Class Michael Thornton, a fellow Navy SEAL whose relationship with Norris would soon become part of an even more extraordinary story. 6 months after the rescue of Hambleton and Clark, Norris would lead another mission that would end in catastrophe and survival against impossible odds. But that story belongs to another chapter. For now, in the spring of 1972, Thomas Norris had done what many believed was impossible. He had gone behind enemy lines twice, had rescued 2 American pilots from the middle of 30,000 enemy troops, and had brought them home alive. It was an achievement that would be studied and admired by special operators for generations to come. The rescue of Bat-21 Bravo became a watershed moment in American military search and rescue doctrine. The Air Force, in particular, conducted extensive after-action reviews to understand what had gone right, what had gone wrong, and how future operations could be conducted with less cost in lives and aircraft. The lessons learned from those 11.5 days in April 1972 would influence search and rescue operations for decades to come. The first and most obvious lesson was that conventional airborne rescue tactics, no matter how bravely executed, had severe limitations when operating in heavily defended enemy territory during a major offensive. Helicopters were simply too vulnerable to concentrated anti-aircraft fire, and the loss ratios during the Bat-21 rescue proved that point with brutal clarity. The establishment of the 17-mile no-fire zone around Hambleton's position had been well-intentioned, designed to prevent friendly fire from killing the man everyone was trying to save. But the operational cost of that restriction had been severe. It had effectively created a safe haven for enemy forces, allowing them to move supplies and reinforcements without fear of American airstrikes. The bridge at Cam Lo, which should have been destroyed early in the offensive, had remained intact and functional because it fell within the no-fire zone. South Vietnamese units fighting desperately to hold back the North Vietnamese advance had been denied the close air support they needed because those aircraft were tied up supporting the rescue operation. The conclusion was clear. Future no-fire zones would need to be much smaller and more carefully considered against the broader tactical situation. Perhaps the most important lesson was the validation of Special Operations ground forces as the primary means of conducting rescues in heavily contested environments. Norris and Kiet had succeeded where dozens of aircraft and hundreds of sorties had failed. They had used stealth, deception, local knowledge, and unconventional tactics to infiltrate enemy territory, locate the downed pilots, and extract them. The fact that they had accomplished this with just 2 men in a sampan, disguised as local fishermen, demonstrated the power of small, highly trained units operating with imagination and courage. The military would invest heavily in developing and refining these capabilities in the years following Vietnam. The Easter Offensive itself continued to rage long after Hambleton's rescue. The North Vietnamese push would eventually be halted, but not before they had inflicted severe losses on South Vietnamese forces, and demonstrated that Vietnamization, the policy of turning the war over to South Vietnamese forces while American troops withdrew, had serious limitations. The fall of Quang Tri Province on May 1, 1972, less than 3 weeks after Hambleton's rescue, was a strategic setback that shocked American planners. The intensive use of American air power had prevented a complete collapse, but it was clear that, without sustained American support, South Vietnam would struggle to survive. This reality would influence American policy for the next 3 years until the final withdrawal and the fall of Saigon in 1975. For the air crews who had flown support missions during the Bat-21 rescue, the operation became part of Air Force legend. The forward air controllers who had maintained contact with Hambleton, who had directed airstrikes with precision despite intense enemy fire, who had coordinated the ground rescue teams, all of these men had performed with a level of skill and dedication that exemplified the best of military aviation. The fighter pilots who had made attack runs in the face of heavy anti-aircraft fire, knowing that SAMs were being launched at them, knowing that many aircraft had already been shot down, had demonstrated the kind of courage that makes air power effective. The helicopter crews who had attempted rescue missions despite knowing the landing zones were death traps had proven yet again that Army aviation would go anywhere, anytime, to bring soldiers home. The story of the Bat-21 rescue was eventually told in a book written by Air Force Colonel William Charles Anderson in 1980, followed by the 1988 film Bat-21, starring Gene Hackman as Hambleton and Danny Glover as a forward air controller. The movie took significant dramatic liberties with the actual events, and notably, it completely omitted the role of Thomas Norris and the ground rescue operation. This was partly due to classification issues, as many details of the mission remained classified when the film was being produced, but it meant that the movie audiences never learned about the most remarkable part of the entire rescue operation. A second book, The Rescue of Bat-21 by Colonel Darrell D. Whitcomb, and published in 1998, provided a much more complete and accurate account based on declassified information. The operational tempo in Vietnam did not slow down for Thomas Norris after the Bat-21 rescue. He remained in country, continuing to work with South Vietnamese Special Forces units on various missions. The war was winding down for American combat forces, but it was intensifying for the Vietnamese who would have to continue the fight after American troops departed. Norris spent his days planning and conducting operations, training Vietnamese SEALs, and proving repeatedly that small teams of highly skilled operators could accomplish missions that seemed impossible. He was not looking for glory or recognition. He was simply doing the job he had been trained to do, serving his country in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. But the job was about to demand more from Norris than anyone could have anticipated. On October 31st, 1972, just 6 months after the Bat-21 rescue, Lieutenant Norris would face a test that made even that extraordinary operation seem manageable by comparison. He would lead a reconnaissance mission into enemy territory near the coast of Quang Tri Province, an area that had been completely overrun by North Vietnamese forces during the Easter Offensive. The mission was supposed to gather intelligence on enemy positions and movements. It would end in an ambush, a catastrophic wound, and an act of heroism that would forge an unbreakable bond between two Navy SEALs and create one of the most remarkable moments in the history of the Medal of Honor. Petty Officer, Second Class, Michael Edwin Thornton was everything that Hollywood imagined a Navy SEAL should be. Big enough to play linebacker for any NFL team, the 23-year-old SEAL was not just large and muscular, he was fearless. He had arrived in Vietnam in January 1970, and by October 1972 was a seasoned veteran with nearly 2 years of combat operations under his belt. If Thomas Norris didn't fit the physical profile we associate with elite warriors, Thornton more than made up for it. He was the recruiting poster kind of Navy SEAL, with the appearance, the knowledge, and the experience to be among the best, in arguably the world's finest elite covert fighting force. But Mike Thornton wasn't interested in being a hero. He just wanted to do his job and be among the best. The two men represented different aspects of what made the SEALs effective. Norris was the thinking man's operator, slight of build, but possessing an iron will and tactical brilliance that allowed him to succeed where others failed. Thornton was the physical specimen, the warrior who could carry wounded men through surf while fighting off enemy soldiers, who could shoot, move, and communicate with devastating effectiveness. Together, they formed the kind of team that special operations forces depend on: complementary skills, absolute trust, and a shared commitment to the mission and to each other. They had worked together on various operations, and each man knew he could count on the other when things went bad. They would soon prove that trust in the most dramatic way possible. On October 31st, 1972, Norris, Thornton, and 3 South Vietnamese Special Forces soldiers departed on a mission to reconnoiter the area around the Cua Viet base near the coast of Quang Tri Province, just south of the demilitarized zone. The area had been firmly in North Vietnamese hands since the Easter Offensive, and American intelligence needed to know what enemy forces were present, how they were deployed, and what their capabilities were. It was a classic SEAL mission. Infiltrate under cover of darkness, gather intelligence without being detected, and extract before the enemy knew you had been there. A Vietnamese junk, a traditional sailing vessel, would insert the team at night and pick them up at a predetermined location when the mission was complete. The insertion went smoothly. The 5-man team moved inland from the beach, navigating by compass and instinct through terrain that was completely controlled by enemy forces. They moved silently through the darkness, freezing whenever they heard or saw enemy patrols, bypassing obstacles, working their way toward their reconnaissance objectives. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, but intelligence about the area was incomplete, and the team was moving into a situation far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The North Vietnamese forces in the area were not just present in small numbers, they were there in strength, with multiple battalions dug in and well organized. As dawn broke on Halloween morning, the team found themselves much closer to enemy positions than they had intended. They had walked into the middle of a North Vietnamese base area without realizing it in the darkness. Enemy soldiers were everywhere, and it was only a matter of time before the SEALs were spotted. Norris made the decision to break contact and move toward the beach where they could be extracted. But they had been seen. North Vietnamese troops began converging on their position from multiple directions. What should have been a covert reconnaissance mission had just turned into a running gunfight for survival. The team moved as quickly as they could toward the extraction point, but the NVA forces were closing in. Small arms fire began to crack through the air around them. The 5 men returned fire while moving, trying to create enough chaos to slow the enemy pursuit without getting pinned down. They made it to the beach area, but instead of finding a clear extraction point, they found themselves on sand dunes with enemy forces approaching from the land side and nowhere to go, but into the ocean. The junk that was supposed to extract them was visible in the distance, but it was too far offshore to provide immediate help. They were trapped, The North Vietnamese realized they had the Americans pinned and began to mass forces for an assault. Norris positioned his small team in the best defensive position he could find among the dunes and prepared to hold as long as possible, hoping the junk could move closer and provide covering fire. The enemy attack came in force. NVA soldiers swarmed over the dunes, firing as they came. The five-man team met them with disciplined fire, each man picking his targets, conserving ammunition, making every shot count. They killed enemy soldiers by the dozens, but there were always more coming. The Vietnamese Special Forces soldiers fought with desperate courage, knowing they would receive no mercy if captured. It was during the height of this desperate defense that Thomas Norris was hit. An enemy round struck him in the head, a devastating wound that would have killed most men instantly. Norris collapsed, blood pouring from the terrible injury. One of the South Vietnamese soldiers saw Norris fall and saw the nature of his wound. In the chaos of combat, with enemy soldiers closing in from all sides, the Vietnamese soldier assumed that Norris was dead. Nobody could survive a head wound like that. The Vietnamese soldier called out to Thornton, telling him that their lieutenant was dead and that they needed to get to the water immediately, or they would all be killed. For a split second, Mike Thornton had a decision to make. He could accept that Norris was dead, fall back to the water with the Vietnamese soldiers, and try to survive. Or he could go back for his teammate's body, exposing himself to point-blank enemy fire on the slim chance that there might be some sign of life. Thornton didn't hesitate. He charged back through enemy fire toward where Norris had fallen. North Vietnamese soldiers were literally on top of the position. Thornton shot several enemy soldiers at close range as he reached Norris, fighting with the kind of focused ferocity that comes from absolute commitment to leaving no one behind. When Mike Thornton reached Thomas Norris, what he saw would have caused most men to turn away in horror. Norris had been shot in the head, the bullet entering near his left eye and causing catastrophic damage. Blood covered his face and soaked into the sand. He wasn't moving, wasn't breathing in any way that Thornton could detect. For a moment, Thornton thought he had risked his life to recover a corpse, but something made him check more carefully. He grabbed Norris, and as he lifted his teammate, he felt the faintest pulse. Norris was alive. Barely, impossibly, but alive. Thornton later said that in that moment, looking at the devastating wound and knowing Norris was somehow still alive, he made a simple decision. If there was even a 1% chance of saving him, he was taking that chance. North Vietnamese soldiers were closing in on Thornton's position, and he was exposed on the sand dunes with no cover. He began fighting a retreat, carrying Norris over his shoulder while firing his weapon with his free hand. It should have been impossible. Norris was not a small man, and carrying a wounded person over soft sand, while under fire, and trying to return that fire, is a feat of strength and endurance that defies normal human capabilities. But Thornton was operating on pure adrenaline and determination. Enemy soldiers appeared over the dunes, and Thornton shot them. More enemy soldiers came, and he shot them too. He killed several North Vietnamese troops at close range while dragging Norris toward the water, leaving a trail of enemy dead in his wake. The beach seemed impossibly far away, and every step was agony. Thornton's legs burned from the exertion, his lungs screamed for air, and enemy rounds were kicking up sand all around him. But he kept moving, kept fighting, refusing to accept that this was where they would die. The 3 Vietnamese Special Forces soldiers were also fighting their way to the water, providing covering fire when they could, engaging enemy troops that threatened to overrun their position. The teamwork that had been drilled into them through countless training exercises and missions was holding under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Thornton reached the water's edge and didn't stop. He waded into the South China Sea, still carrying Norris, as bullets impacted the water around them. The ocean offered both salvation and danger. It would provide cover from enemy fire once they got deep enough, but it also meant trying to keep an unconscious, severely wounded man afloat while swimming through surf. One of the Vietnamese soldiers had also been wounded and was unable to swim. Thornton found himself supporting 2 men, Norris over one shoulder and the wounded Vietnamese soldier with his other arm, while trying to swim away from the beach. It was an impossible situation, and yet Thornton made it work through sheer force of will. The junk that had inserted them finally began moving closer to shore, but it still had to maintain distance from the beach to avoid being hit by enemy fire. Thornton swam toward it, supporting 2 injured men for more than 2 hours. The physical toll was beyond description. His arms and legs were cramping, seawater and blood mixed together. Norris remained unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. The wounded Vietnamese soldier was in shock and unable to help himself. Thornton later said he simply focused on one stroke at a time, one breath at a time, refusing to think about how far they still had to go, or how much his body was protesting. He had made the decision to save his teammates, and he would complete that mission or die trying. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the junk. Willing hands reached down to pull the wounded men aboard, and Thornton was able to release the burden he had been carrying for so long. As soon as Norris was on the deck, Thornton began administering first aid, trying to stop the bleeding, checking for other wounds, doing everything he could to keep his lieutenant alive until they could reach proper medical care. The junk headed for shore at full speed, and as soon as they reached friendly territory, Norris was rushed to a medical facility. Doctors who examined him gave him almost no chance of survival. The head wound was too severe, the damage too extensive. But they began working on him anyway, starting the long process of trying to save a man who should already have been dead. Thomas Norris underwent emergency surgery to repair what damage could be repaired, and to prevent infection and brain swelling from killing him. He was then evacuated to more advanced medical facilities for additional surgeries. Over the following months, he would undergo multiple operations as doctors worked to save his life, and then to restore as much function as possible. He lost his left eye completely. Part of his skull had been destroyed and needed to be reconstructed. The cognitive effects of such a severe traumatic brain injury were initially profound. For a time, it was unclear whether Norris would ever be able to function independently again, let alone return to any kind of normal life. But Thomas Norris was not a man who gave up easily. Over 3 years of hospitalization and rehabilitation, he fought his way back. He relearned skills that the brain injury had taken from him. He adapted to the loss of his eye and learned to function with the physical limitations his wounds imposed. The process was agonizing and frustrating, but Norris approached it with the same determination he had shown on every mission he had ever conducted. By 1975, he had recovered enough to be considering what came next in his life. The Navy medically retired him, recognizing that he could no longer serve on active duty. But retirement didn't mean the end of his service to his country. For his actions on October 31, 1972, Mike Thornton was recommended for the Medal of Honor. The award was approved with unusual speed. And on October 15, 1973, less than a year after the mission, Thornton stood in the White House as President Richard Nixon placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. Among those in attendance was Thomas Norris, who had been secretly brought to the ceremony by Thornton. Norris was still hospitalized, still recovering from his wounds, and technically wasn't supposed to leave the hospital. But Thornton had snuck him out so that Norris could witness the ceremony. It was a fitting gesture for 2 men whose bond had been forged in the crucible of combat. The story of Norris and Thornton became legendary within the SEAL community and throughout the military. Here were 2 Medal of Honor recipients, one who had saved downed pilots behind enemy lines and earned the nation's highest decoration, and another who had earned the same decoration by saving the first recipient's life. It was unprecedented in modern times. The last time one Medal of Honor recipient had saved the life of another was during the Civil War, more than a century earlier. The bond between Norris and Thornton represented everything that was best about the military: loyalty, courage, and an absolute refusal to leave anyone behind regardless of the cost. Thomas Norris faced an uncertain future as he recovered from his wounds. At 30 years old, he was medically retired from the Navy. His career as a SEAL over before he had reached the midpoint of what might have been a distinguished 20 or 30-year military career. The wounds he had sustained would have permanent effects. He was blind in his left eye, had significant scarring, and dealt with ongoing medical issues related to the traumatic brain injury. Many men in his position would have focused on their disability compensation and finding some quiet way to live out their years. But Norris had not forgotten his original dream, the one that had led him to study criminology at the University of Maryland before the military had intervened in his plans. He wanted to be an FBI agent. It seemed like an impossible goal. The FBI had strict medical standards for new agents, and a one-eyed man with a traumatic brain injury and a Medal of Honor was going to face serious obstacles in meeting those standards. But in 1979, Norris decided to apply. When his application reached FBI Director William Webster, there was understandable skepticism about whether he could meet the Bureau's requirements. Webster, however, was impressed by Norris's record and his determination. His response to Norris was direct and challenging. "If you can pass the same test as anybody else applying for this organization, I will waive your disabilities. You have certainly earned it." Norris took that challenge seriously. He studied for the entrance examination, prepared himself physically for the fitness tests, and in September 1979, he passed every requirement. The FBI accepted him as a special agent, beginning what would become a 20-year career in federal law enforcement. Norris was assigned initially to counterterrorism work, an area where his military background and understanding of unconventional operations proved invaluable. He brought to the FBI a level of tactical expertise that few other agents possessed, and his ability to remain calm under extreme pressure served him well in investigating some of the most dangerous criminals and terrorists of the era. In the mid-1980s, the FBI decided to create the Hostage Rescue Team, an elite unit modeled partly on military special operations forces and designed to respond to the most dangerous situations that federal law enforcement might face. The team would be trained to conduct tactical rescues, neutralize armed threats, and operate in environments where normal law enforcement tactics were insufficient. When the FBI began selecting personnel for this new unit, Thomas Norris was an obvious choice. He became one of the original members of the Hostage Rescue Team, serving as an assault team leader. His experience as a Navy SEAL, his tactical knowledge, and his proven courage under fire made him ideally suited for the role. The Hostage Rescue Team would go on to become one of the most respected tactical units in federal law enforcement, involved in countless operations over the decades since its founding. Norris's contribution to building that team and establishing its standards and procedures cannot be overstated. He helped train new members, develop tactics and techniques, and participated in operations that required the absolute best law enforcement had to offer. The fact that he did all of this while dealing with the lasting effects of his combat wounds made his achievement even more remarkable. He proved that disability, even severe disability, does not have to define what a person can accomplish. Norris's FBI career was marked by the same quiet professionalism that had characterized his military service. He didn't seek publicity or recognition. He simply did the job, served his country in a different uniform, and contributed to protecting Americans from threats both domestic and international. His colleagues in the FBI knew about his Medal of Honor, but Norris didn't make a big deal of it. He was there to work, to be part of the team, to solve problems and catch bad guys. The Medal of Honor was something he had earned in a different life, fighting a different kind of war. Now he was focused on the mission at hand, whatever that mission might be. In 1976, while Norris was still in the early stages of his recovery from his wounds, he was informed that he would be receiving the Medal of Honor for the rescue of Hambleton and Clark. The award had been delayed partly because much of the mission remained classified, and partly because of Norris's initial reluctance to accept the nomination. But once the mission was declassified and the full story could be told, there was no question that his actions merited the nation's highest recognition. On March 6, 1976, President Gerald Ford presented the Medal of Honor to Thomas Norris in a White House ceremony. Among those in attendance were Norris's parents and brothers, and prominently, Mike Thornton, the man who had saved his life and who had already received his own Medal of Honor. The ceremony was emotional for everyone present. Norris stood as living proof of what Thornton's heroism had accomplished. Without Thornton's courage and determination, Norris would have died on that beach in October 1972, and he would never have received the Medal of Honor, never have joined the FBI, never have contributed to the Hostage Rescue Team. Thornton's presence at the ceremony was a reminder that heroism creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate action. By saving Norris, Thornton had preserved not just a life, but a legacy of continued service that would benefit the nation for decades. Norris retired from the FBI after 20 years of service, settling in northern Idaho. He remained active in veterans organizations and occasionally spoke about his experiences, though he never sought the spotlight. He maintained his friendship with Mike Thornton, the two men bound together by experiences that few others could truly understand. They had both faced death, had both refused to accept defeat. and had both demonstrated the kind of courage that defines the special operations community. Their story became part of SEAL tradition, told to new generations of operators as an example of what the teams were all about. The missions that Thomas Norris conducted in April 1972 remain among the most extraordinary individual achievements in the history of American special operations. Consider what he accomplished in the span of just 4 days. He led 5 separate missions into enemy territory during the height of the largest North Vietnamese offensive of the war. He successfully extracted 2 American pilots from the middle of 30,000 enemy troops. He adapted his tactics when conventional approaches failed, adopting the audacious disguise of a Vietnamese fisherman to paddle openly through enemy positions. He coordinated air support under fire, navigated through hostile territory with minimal support, and accomplished what dozens of aircraft and hundreds of sorties had failed to achieve. The impact of these missions extended far beyond the immediate rescue of 2 men. At a strategic level, the Bat-21 rescue forced the American military to rethink how it conducted search and rescue operations in contested environments. The costly aerial attempts demonstrated the limitations of conventional helicopter operations when facing sophisticated air defenses. The success of Norris's ground-based approach validated the concept of using small, highly trained special operations teams for missions that conventional forces could not accomplish. These lessons influenced the development of search and rescue doctrine for decades, shaping how America would conduct combat rescue operations in future conflicts. At a tactical level, Norris's missions demonstrated the power of innovation and unconventional thinking. When the obvious approach fails, when the enemy has anticipated your methods and prepared counters, success requires the ability to think differently. Norris's decision to disguise himself as a Vietnamese fisherman and paddle openly up a river controlled by enemy forces was brilliant because it was so unexpected. The North Vietnamese were looking for helicopter insertions, commando raids under cover of darkness, American tactics that they understood and could defend against. They were not expecting 2 men in a sampan who looked like local fishermen and moved with the confidence of people who belong there. That willingness to think outside conventional parameters is what separates good special operators from great ones. The human cost of the Bat-21 rescue serves as a sobering reminder that warfare is never clean, never simple, never without consequences. 11 Americans died in various rescue attempts. 2 were captured. Countless South Vietnamese soldiers died because air support was diverted to the rescue operation. The resources expended on saving 1 man had broader strategic and tactical implications that continue to be debated. But those debates miss something fundamental. The principle that we do not abandon our people is not just about the individual being rescued. It is about the bond of trust that makes military forces effective. Soldiers fight with greater courage, take greater risks, and endure greater hardships when they know with absolute certainty that their comrades will come for them if they fall. The cost of the Bat-21 rescue may have been high, but the cost of breaking that bond of trust would have been incalculable. Petty Officer 3rd Class Nguyen Van Kiet deserves special recognition in the story of the Bat-21 rescue. When the other Vietnamese commandos refused to continue, when the mission seemed impossible and certain to end in death, Kiet volunteered to accompany Norris. He paddled that sampan through enemy territory with the same calm courage as Norris, risked his life to save an American he had never met, and proved that heroism transcends national boundaries. His Navy Cross, the only such decoration awarded to a South Vietnamese naval officer during the entire war, was recognition that Allied forces contributed significantly to what America accomplished in Vietnam. The story of Norris and Kiet is a reminder that many of the most extraordinary achievements of the war were joint efforts, Americans and Vietnamese working together against a common enemy. Michael Thornton's rescue of Thomas Norris represents a different kind of heroism, but one equally deserving of recognition. Thornton had a split second to decide whether to leave his lieutenant for dead or risk his own life on what seemed like a hopeless effort to recover a body. His choice to charge back into enemy fire, his fight to carry Norris to the water, his 2-hour swim supporting 2 wounded men, all of it demonstrated a level of commitment to the team and to the mission that defines what special operations forces aspire to be. The fact that one Medal of Honor recipient saved the life of another became a unique moment in military history. a story that encapsulated the values that make units like the SEALs effective. The subsequent careers of both Norris and Thornton after their combat service demonstrates another important truth. The skills, values, and character developed in military service have applications far beyond the battlefield. Norris's 20-year career with the FBI, including his role as a founding member of the hostage rescue team, showed that the tactical expertise and cool judgment required of a Navy SEAL translated directly to federal law enforcement. His ability to assess situations quickly, to lead under pressure, and to accomplish difficult missions served him as well in the FBI as it had in Vietnam. Thornton also continued his service, remaining a valued member of the Special Operations community for many years after the war. The story of Thomas Norris and the Bat-21 rescue has been told in books, documentaries, and training materials for military personnel. It is studied at special operations schools as an example of how small teams can accomplish strategic objectives. It is referenced in discussions of military culture and the importance of never leaving anyone behind. It has inspired generations of young Americans to pursue service in special operations, drawn by the example of men who demonstrated extraordinary courage in the service of their nation and their teammates. The legacy of those missions in April 1972 continues to influence how America trains, equips, and employs its special operations forces. Gene Hambleton, the man at the center of the rescue operation, retired from the Air Force about a year after his ordeal and lived quietly in Arizona until his death in 2004. He never forgot what had been endured to bring him home. He carried the weight of knowing that men had died trying to save his life. In interviews, Hambleton spoke with profound gratitude about the pilots who had flown cover for him, the forward air controllers who had maintained contact, and especially about Thomas Norris and Nguyen Van Kiet, who had risked everything to pull him out of enemy territory. He understood that his survival had come at a terrible price, and he spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that sacrifice. Mark Clark, the first pilot Norris rescued, also carried memories of his time on the ground and his desperate extraction. He knew that men had died in attempts to reach him before Norris succeeded. He understood the extraordinary risks that Norris and the Vietnamese commandos had taken. In later years, when asked about his experience, Clark would emphasize the courage of the men who refused to leave him behind. He became an advocate for veterans, working to ensure that the sacrifices made during the Vietnam War were remembered and honored. His gratitude to Norris never diminished, and the two men maintained contact over the years. The Easter Offensive of 1972 would ultimately be halted, but not before it had demonstrated the limitations of Vietnamization and foreshadowed the eventual fall of South Vietnam. The intensive use of American air power during the offensive, including the B-52 strikes and tactical air support, prevented a complete North Vietnamese victory. But it was clear that without that air support, South Vietnamese forces would have been overrun. When American involvement in Vietnam ended in 1973 with the Paris Peace Accords, it was only a matter of time before North Vietnam would launch another offensive. That final offensive would come in 1975, and this time there would be no American air support to stop it. Saigon fell on April 30th, 1975, and the war that had consumed so many American and Vietnamese lives was finally over. Thomas Norris watched the fall of Saigon from a hospital in the United States, still recovering from his wounds. He thought about the Vietnamese special operators he had worked with, men like Nguyen Van Kiet, who had fought alongside Americans with courage and skill. He wondered what had happened to them, whether they had escaped or whether they were now facing the vengeance of the victorious North. Many of the South Vietnamese who had worked with American forces ended up in re-education camps or as refugees. Kiet's ultimate fate is uncertain. Though it is known he survived the war, the fall of South Vietnam was a bitter ending to a conflict that had demanded so much and accomplished so little in strategic terms. But if the war itself ended in defeat, the individual acts of courage and sacrifice that characterized it retained their meaning. Thomas Norris did not rescue Hambleton and Clark because he thought it would change the outcome of the war. He did it because they were Americans, because they needed help, because that was what SEALs did. The larger political and strategic questions were beyond his control. What was within his control was the mission in front of him, the men who needed rescue, and his own willingness to risk everything to bring them home. That kind of courage, that commitment to teammates and mission, transcends the outcome of any individual war. It represents values that are fundamental to military service and to American identity. Today, the Naval Special Warfare Group 2 maintains a building named in honor of Thomas Norris at Little Creek, Virginia. The Lieutenant Thomas R. Norris Building serves as a daily reminder to Navy SEALs of what their predecessors accomplished and what they aspire to achieve. When new SEAL candidates go through training, when operators prepare for missions, when leaders make difficult decisions, the example of Thomas Norris and men like him provides a standard to measure against. The building's name is more than just recognition of past valor. It is a commitment to maintaining the standards and values that men like Norris embodied. In his later years, when occasionally asked about his Medal of Honor and his extraordinary missions, Thomas Norris consistently deflected attention from himself. He would talk about his teammates, about the Vietnamese commandos who risked their lives, about the air crews who provided support, about all the people who contributed to the success of the missions. He would emphasize that he had simply been fortunate to be in a position to accomplish something important. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a SEAL who had done his job. That humility, that focus on the team rather than individual glory, is characteristic of the special operations community at its best. When a CBS News reporter approached Norris shortly after the rescue of Hambleton and suggested that the mission must have been so rough that Norris probably wouldn't do it again, Norris's response was immediate and emphatic. An American was down in enemy territory. Of course I'd do it again. That statement encapsulates everything about Thomas Norris and what he represented. It wasn't about whether the mission was dangerous or difficult. It wasn't about calculating odds or weighing risks. It was about duty, about commitment to fellow Americans, about the fundamental principle that we do not leave our people behind. Given the same circumstances, facing the same odds, Norris would make the same choice every time. Thomas Norris is now in his 80s, living quietly in retirement. The scars of his service are visible on his face, permanent reminders of the price he paid. But those scars also tell a story of courage, determination, and service that few can match. He went into the heart of hell twice in April 1972, behind enemy lines surrounded by 30,000 hostile troops, and brought Americans home. He survived a wound that should have killed him, thanks to the heroism of Mike Thornton. He rebuilt his life, served his country for another 20 years in the FBI, and contributed to protecting Americans in a different way. His legacy is not just the 2 pilots he rescued or the missions he accomplished. His legacy is the example he set, the standard he established, and the values he embodied throughout a lifetime of service. The story of Thomas Norris is a story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demanded. He was not born a hero. He became one through choice, through training, through a willingness to risk everything for principles he believed in. He faced impossible odds and refused to accept that impossible meant failure. He adapted when conventional approaches didn't work, innovated when creativity was required, and persevered when perseverance seemed pointless. He demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. And he proved that service to others, commitment to teammates, and dedication to mission are values that transcend any individual conflict or era. That is the legacy of Thomas Norris, and it is a legacy that will inspire Americans for generations to come.